Hey, I'm Kim with Kolme Group, and our team helps PMOs achieve success through data-driven decision making. We're also premier implementation partner for Clarizen, our favorite PPM tool. And Clarizen just released some new functionality for their Clarizen One platform, which opens the door to some really powerful financial functionality. So today, we're going to add that new financial feature to another one of Clarizen's powerful features, custom objects, and come up with something really cool. What we're going to end up with by the end of today's session is a solution that uses custom invoices module using custom objects to track the actual costs to your project. And it's going to integrate those costs into your project's time phase financials using the new Clarizen feature. Now, while we're going to keep it really pretty simple for today's video and just talk about invoices that are costs to your project, you can also track invoices that are sent from your project out to a customer. You can also track purchase orders. You can also extend the solution and track revenue forecasts to your project. You can look at a product catalog, a bill of materials, or even just materials that hit your project for cost. You can do change requests. And by the way, that's not the official change request icon, but I think it probably should be. And then finally, you can also extend this out to risks and look at contingency and how the potential cost impact of risks can impact your project and what kind of contingency you should have from a budget perspective. And these are just a few ideas on where you can take this amazing solution. This functionality was technically possible before, but it did require a lot of custom configuration. Clarizen's new feature makes this so much easier that in today's course, we're going to both set up a custom object for your invoices and build that integration into your project financials. And it's going to take, I don't know, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. Now, to do that, we're going to keep today's course really simple. It's going to be quick and basic configuration so we can focus on the new feature, but you can get really sophisticated as we showed you earlier. And here is a quick peek into what the finished product is going to look like at the end of our video. Here I have my standard banana peeling project, for example, and here I have embedded a custom financial panel. We won't do that in today's class. We'll have another video that shows how to do this. But if you have a separate financial panel, you can toggle to that view and see the results. And what I've got is the ability now to add an invoice that's incurred to my project. So I've executed some work, I've got an invoice that comes in, and that cost has to be reflected in my project as an actual cost. So I'm going to add an invoice here manually. Of course, you can do that using a bulk import or an API import. Today, we're going to keep it simple. Have an invoice for more bananas from my banana peeling project. And we'll say that that hit us in the March timeframe. I'll pick a date in March. Cost type, well, that's bananas or hardware. So, and we'll have a cost of $150. I'll save my invoice. And when I refresh, we'll now see that I have an actual cost that's incurred to my project in March for my more bananas. And this is great because you can bulk import or update your project actuals based on maybe a spreadsheet of invoices from your finance department. And that can keep your project up to date with your actuals, which is a great new feature. And it's really not too hard to do. Of course, you can extend this. You can see I've also created some project change requests. This one has an estimated cost of $3,500, and I've got that shown as a budgeted cost in the May timeframe. So I can use change requests. I can even attach expected or potential costs to risks, even issues, and I can now track those in financials. But today, we're going to keep it simple, and we're just going to focus on getting invoices added in your project and having those actuals show up in your project financials. And before we jump in, I want to welcome you to Kolme University's Clarizen Mini Masterclass and let you know that we'll have a link at the end of this video or in the notes below, depending on where you're viewing this video, where you can download sample configurations and a detailed checklist that will walk you through all the steps that we go through today. You'll also want to sign up to be notified when we release more videos like this one. And we're also getting ready to launch Kolme University's Clarizen Configuration Masterclass, which will take you through solutions like this one, but in much greater detail than we can in today's little mini masterclass format. This will allow us to take these solutions much further, and those will all be available to you when you subscribe to Kolme University. So let's get started. Starting with course prerequisites. First, of course, you need a Clarizen One environment. There should be a sandbox. We highly recommend that you do this in a sandbox environment and not your production environment. You need administrative access, and you need to enable system setting 9.64 financial planning. You need one available custom object, and you should set up a financial planning view on your project object in advance. That'll make this easier. For yourself, some basic Clarizen One technical skills that we recommend is we recommend that you have gone through the Clarizen administrative training in advance. We recommend that you should be familiar with how to create a custom field and a workflow rule. We'll walk you through, but you should have some idea of what you're doing there. You should understand basic profile management, be able to add fields to views and property cards, and you should have a grasp of the basic concepts around Clarizen financial planning. We'll have some links in the downloads where you can read about some of these topics as well. Now, if you're not familiar with Clarizen's financial planning and time phase data structures and capabilities, then you really should go to the Clarizen Success site and read up on it there. I'll show you there's a ton of information. Just go to success.clarizen.com, search for financial planning. We've got all these different articles that will walk you through step by step how to set it up and how it works. And it's a really, really great feature. We're not going to go into much detail on that today, but just to give you a quick overview of how it impacts us. Life without financial planning and time phase is something like this. I have my very simple project. I've got my tasks. And because I have an amount of work for each one of these tasks, I multiply that by the cost rates for each resource, and I get a budgeted or an estimated amount for that task. You roll that up and you get an estimated for the project, and I can see actuals as they roll in. And this is okay, it's very basic. It lets me see by task what things are going to cost me and what things are actually costing me, and this is good. But sometimes I have multiple tasks in a single month, or more often tasks will break across multiple months. So how do I know month by month what my project should cost me and what it's actually going to cost me? Well, that's where our financial planning and time phase comes in. If I change my view to my financial planning view, you can see that month by month, I can take each one of my resources, and rather than looking at it task by task, I can see resource by resource what it's going to cost for each month, what it should cost and what it's actually going to cost, and then the roll up for the entire month. And this is exactly what you need if you're planning a project or managing your portfolio. You need to know what the costs should be and what they actually are for each month through the project. And so what you can do is you can manage objects on your kind of your overview or multi-panel view. And then if you want to see the time phase, you can jump over here and look at your financial planning view. Now, if you haven't seen our video yet, we've got another course, which is the one immediately before this one, called Financial Planning View in a Custom Panel. And you'll see me demonstrating that later in this video, so don't get confused. You'll see a view that looks like this, but I'm going to the bottom and there's a button that says Add Related. That's because I've created a new view. So what I recommend is if you haven't done it yet, go create this other view using this other video, and I'll show you what it gives you. Is you see here, I've got a multi-panel view, and what I can do is I take that financial planning panel and I've embedded it right here in the project, in this panel. And so what I can do is I can add a related, I can add an invoice here, which you'll see me doing in the demo later. And then I can see the financials here in this panel. And this is not out of the box. There's a very specific method you can use for it. If you look at our video, Financial Planning View in a Custom Panel, we'll walk you through step by step how to create this panel. It takes about 15 minutes. So if you haven't done it yet, I recommend you put this video on pause, go watch this video, create yourself this great custom panel, and it makes the rest of this video a lot easier to do. Otherwise, you have to go back and forth from something like a view like this, a view like your overview, then you add your invoice objects, but you can't see the financials until you jump back and forth. So it'll be easier. So go search out that video and come back and join us for the rest of this one. And so the steps we'll be taking today in our solution is, first, we're going to set up a custom object for invoices. In that, we're going to create a custom object. We're going to create a relation field from that invoice into the project. We're going to set up some custom fields on our new invoice object, and we're going to set up the profiles for that custom object for our invoices, so we can easily get in there and manage those. Then we're going to create some non-labor resources, or NLRs as we call them, that will help you categorize different costs. So maybe you've got software invoices and you've got hardware invoices and external labor invoices. Of course, there's no limit to the number of categories you can have. We're just going to start with those 3 today. And then finally, we're going to build a couple of workflows that are going to take the financial data from our invoices and add them into the project financial. To create my custom object, I'm going to go to Settings and Configurations. And down at the bottom here, I'm going to add custom object. We're going to call it an invoice. Multiple are invoices. ID prefix is going to be INV. Let's choose an appropriate icon for an invoice. That looks good. And we'll create. All right, now that we have our new object, our invoice down here under custom objects, let's add some fields. Create new custom field. We're going to create 4 of them, starting with a reference to an object. We want to create a relationship from our invoices to projects. This approach will give us a many-to-one relationship from many invoices to a single project. We'll call this project. Access referencing. So from the project perspective, looking backwards, we'll call these invoices. There we go. And save and new. Next, we're going to create a cost type pick list. Let's find pick list in here. Cost type, because we may have multiple categories that invoices can come into. I might have software invoices, I might have hardware costs, I might have external labor costs, and I want to be able to categorize each of those as they come in and summarize total actual costs by each one of those categories. So let's add those as pick list values. So I can have software, I can have hardware, I can have external labor costs. These are costs that are hitting our project from invoices, so we need to have a currency field for cost. And we'll allow 2 digits on that currency. And finally, this is time phase data, so we have to have a time of some kind. In this case, we'll just have a date of, oh, not Dave, a date for our invoice. And there we have it. I have my new invoice object. I have 4 custom fields, 1 for cost, that's a currency, a cost type, which is a pick list, date for my invoice, and a project relationship so that I can tie those together. Before we go and play with this, we need to make sure we can see all these. So let's go to Profiles, and we'll update the master profile. Starting with looking at project, we need to make sure we can see the related invoices from the project. So let's take a look at field relations and related items and make sure that we see at the bottom, yep, invoices are there. And we're going to tick this box that says new by default. There we go. And let's do one more thing. For our new invoices, let's set up some default property cards and then add an edit field. So when I look at the detail on my invoices, I want to see some information, in particular, my new cost field, cost type, and the date of that invoice, as well as what is the related project. That'll be on the property card. And then when I click to add a new invoice, I need to have some fields present there as well. So we're going to edit the add and edit mode field. Here it's blank, so we want definitely to have the cost type, and the date. We'll add project in there too, but we won't usually need that depending on how we're adding it. Put it above the more information separator. And there we go. So let's go try to create an invoice. All right, looking at my projects, let's take a look at my simple test project. And from here, I'm going to click Add Related at the bottom here. And there it is, invoices. Add a related invoice. I'm going to call this Test Invoice 1. The cost type will be, say, software. Cost will be $120. And the date that will be incurred is, let's pick, let's say that was a June cost. I'm going to save that. And when I refresh, what you'll see is that although my test project is here, let's add some more columns into that view. We want to see my cost type and my cost, date, and I won't need to see the project. So even though I've got a software cost of $120, it hasn't created my non-labor category, and I don't see this actual cost hitting in June at all. Why is that? Well, because I've just created the custom object. I have not created any relationship between this custom object and my time phase financials. We're going to do that soon, but first, let's make sure we have all of the right non-labor categories created and configured in a way that my business rules can access them. We're going to go to non-labor resources. And I can see I've only have one of my non-labor resources created that I need. I've got hardware. So I also need to add software. And let's also add external labor. Now, when I develop my business rules to reference these containers, I don't want to have a hard-coded reference to a specific object. It's just not good coding practice. So I need to have some kind of a place in the system where I can store global variables. And there is such a place. Let me show you. And this is going to be best practice from a configuration standpoint. We want to store them on our global settings area. So the way we'll do that is I'm going to go into configurations, organization, and I'm going to create some custom fields. I'm going to create a reference to a non-labor resource because that's what those are. And what first one's going to be called software NLR. Now I'm going to create another one, another reference to non-labor resource. This one is going to be hardware NLR. Save and new. And finally, one more reference to object for external labor NLR. Now, this is best practice to add some more notes, but we're just kind of bypassing that for sake of expediency here. And there we go. Now I have my 3 references on the organization. And if I go to global settings, I can find those here in properties. If I look for NLR, I have my 3 fields. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to populate those with a pointer to the non-labor resource. And I'll show you why we want to do this in a minute. Not really a required step, but it's going to make your code a lot easier, and it's a best practice. Hardware. And finally, software. So now anywhere in my business rules where I cite any one of these variables, or these fields rather, on the organization level, it's going to give me a pointer to the correct and updated non-labor resource. Now, in practice, the solution, what we would do is we'd create validation rules, which prevent us from changing these fields once they're set up, or from deleting these non-labor resources, because if these are deleted, then it can break your solution. So in practice, we would create some validation rules for that. We're going to just keep that really simple today, and we're not gonna bother with that right now. And now all of our pre-work is completed. We have our custom object created, and we have done the pre-work that we need on our non-labor resources, which our business rules are going to need. So let's go to configuration and start by setting up our first workflow rule. This is going to run on the invoice. So I'm going to create a new All right, let's name our new workflow rule update invoice time phase financials. I'm going to tag the invoices just for easier management. And this is going to update project time phase actuals when a new invoice is added or when the invoice cost is changed. We're going to run this every time a record is created or edited. And for the evaluation criteria, I'm going to use, well, I want this to happen if it's new, or I want this to trigger if somebody changes the cost on the invoice. So I'll say is changed, and the name of that field is cost. Oops. Or is changed the related project. And I'll tell you why we do this one in just a moment. This is a really important one and probably more pertinent than is new. More on that in just a moment. And we also want to make sure that we're only adding time phase data when we have a related project, because we don't want to try to update time phase financials when there's no time phase relation. So we'll have to say not is null. So we can't have nothing in the project field. We have to have a related project. Oops. And what else do we have? And we have to make sure we have a date. These are time phase financials. So if I try to link a time phase financial and I don't have a time frame, I can't really do that. So I make sure that my field for date is definitely not null. And then finally, of course, I have to know which category I'm putting the cost into. So I have to make sure that my cost type is not null. Have to have a value in there. All right, let's check syntax. Now it works. Let's walk through it. So I trigger this workflow rule whenever I've got a new object. When the object is changed or the cost is changed, so I have to update the financials then, or whenever the related project is changed. And that's, again, that's going to be important. I'll show you why in just a moment. Now let's get down to the meat of it. We're going to have an action. First, I'm going to set a variable because I have to look at the project action, determine what is the non-labor resource category I want to put into. Let me show you what I mean by that. Is when I look at my project, right now I have one non-labor category, but what if it's software? That requires another non-labor category. What if it's external labor? That goes somewhere else. So I have to map what's on my project as a cost type to the cost type here. And we're going to do that first by we're going to set up a new variable. We're going to call this non-labor cost type. And we're going to make this a reference to an object, and that's a reference to a non-labor resource. So those are our non-labor resource categories that we showed over here. So I have a reference to one of those. And the way I'm going to determine which is the right non-labor resource cost type is I'm going to use a case statement. And we will cover this more in depth in more Kolme master classes, but simply put, I'm going to take and convert my pick list cost type into a string. And if the value of that string is software, oops, then I'm going to use remember our organizational pointers, I'm going to go to variables, organizational fields, and if it's software, there we go. I'm going to point it to my software non-labor resource. If the value is hardware, oops, little typo there. Then I'm going to point it to my non-labor resource pointer. And my default condition, if it's not hardware or software, well, then it must be my default value, which will be external labor, non-labor resource. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a variable pointing to a non-labor resource, and I'm going to pick that depending on what kind of invoice I've got. What's the category? Now that I've got that set, I am ready to set financial time phase data. This is the new action that's been released by Clarizen. If I scroll to the very bottom, I've got set financial time phase data. And the options I have is I can replace the value altogether that's here. And well, I don't really want to replace the whole value. I want it to be added or subtracted because I may have multiple invoices that are being added to this. So if I add another invoice, I don't want to replace whatever value I've got here. I want to increment that value. And I'm going to use a given period. I could choose a fixed period and I can spread the costs over that period, but I'm going to keep it simple. And remember, the date we're going to use is our date. And we're going to have it start and end on that date. Now, non-labor resource that we're going to choose, well, we're going to cite our variable name because we've already figured out what's the right non-labor to use. So I'm going to call that variable name. And the work item is the reference to object, which is project. I'm going to reference my related project. Expense type and billable, I'm going to leave those blank. What's going to happen when I save it is it's going to automatically populate with some text. I'm just not going to mess with that. I'm going to leverage the information that's already there. Now, when I create this, I've got to decide what kind of cost I'm going to add. And that is going to be actual cost, because these are actual costs hitting your project. But you can see that if I want to expand this functionality, I can update other financial fields. I can update the budgeted cost, the revenue. I can update all these different information in the project financials. But again, today we're going to keep it simple. And my actual cost is going to equal the cost on my invoice. So I've set my non-labor resource type, my work item, the dates, and the actual costs. I'm going to add one more little step here just to keep my financials up to date. And this is also a newer action. It's going to be called Calculate Project Financials. And what this is going to do is really just update the financial table. I'm going to run it on the project I'm going to update will be the project. And there we go. Let's save this and enable it. Let's try it out. So I'm going to go back here. Let's delete this old invoice. And let's add a new one. This is going to be invoice number 2. Cost type is going to be software. See, right now I don't have a non-labor category for software, but I do have an invoice for it. Let me show you what that's going to do. That's going to be for $150, and that's going to hit me in, say, June 3rd. Refresh that. I don't technically have to refresh this because I've done that as part of the workflow, but just to make sure we can see this. Now we see I've got a software non-labor resource that's been automatically added. And I can see that I've got an actual cost incurred in June. Let's add another one just to make sure that wasn't a fluke. So I'll say invoice 2 for consultants. Say external labor. Going to have a date of May. Cost of, let's say, $500. And here you can see if I just refresh my browser, that does the same thing because my time phase are updated as part of my workflow. And there we go. I've got external labor actuals in May of $500. And these are additive too. So just to make sure I've got a good test, I'm going to add another one to May. Let's see, I'm going to add one for, let's say, $250. Invoice 3. It's going to be, what else have I got there? It's going to be external labor in May. So when I click save, this should update that to $750. And there we go, $750. And that works pretty well, but there's a couple things we need to do to make this work quite right. So remember, we configured this to update when I add a new invoice, but we also want to update it in case somebody, say, changes the value here. Of course, in practice, you probably aren't going to be changing invoice values, but in another use case, you might change a value here and want it to be reflected here. That's not going to work exactly the way we want it to, the way this is set up right now, because whenever this runs, whenever I change a value, what it's going to do, remember, it increments it. So let's say in this project, this is set at $750. If I change this value from 500 to 600, it's going to add $600 to this value. I don't want that. I want it to take off the old value first and then add the new value. Otherwise, it always goes up and up and up every time I change a record. So what I've got to do is add a little condition in here. So first I have to tell when it's a new record versus an old one. Now, here's a kind of a pro tip from a kind of Clarizen configuration. There are almost two steps that occur when you create an object and it's related. So it's first we create the invoice. The invoice object is created. Then after that, the backend then creates the relationship from the invoice to the project. It's actually two steps. So if I try to trigger something on creation that depends on the relationship, very often it will fail. It's almost like it doesn't know that the related project is there yet. It's like it's not there. So it's almost a sequence. First, we create the object, and then the backend system creates the relationship. So if I were to do just fire this only when an object is new, it's not going to work because I don't have a related project yet, which is why I have when the project is changed, which actually is being populated for the first time, now it actually works. And so the same thing happens down here, is that when I want to update the actual cost, I have to first see if is changed. So basically, if the related project is changed, which happens when it's first created because it goes from nothing to being populated with a relationship, then it's a new one, in which case I do update it with cost. Otherwise, if the project is not changed, meaning that the object is already there, somebody just updated the cost, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the cost, and I'm going to subtract the previous value of cost. And the way I do that is there is a nice feature function called get previous, where is it? Get previous value. So I'm going to get the previous value of that field. That field being cost. And I'll explain this in just a second. So if it's basically a new record, I'm just going to add the value of the cost into Timephase Financials. If it's not a new one, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the new value for cost, and I'm going to subtract the previous value of cost from the time phase. This is the only way we can get that to populate correctly. So if I apply this, oops, I've got missing one of those. Looks good. Now that's saved. Now what happens is, let's take a look at our external labor for May. If I change this from 500 to 750, what should happen is we'll see this value update to 1,000. And it does take a second to roll up, but I can see on the detail level it's 1,000. Let me just do one more refresh. It'll get there. And there we go. We have 1,000 now. So now I know that updates I make to my cost are going to propagate up into here. Now you might be thinking, well, what happens if I'm actually changing what project this goes to? That change in the project-related project field is from moving this from one project to another. That's more logic we won't go into today. There's a lot of validation rules you can put around that. But there we go. Now there's one other edge case I want to talk about because it's something you might run into depending on how you're going to use these, is what happens when I delete a record. So I've got this external labor for 750. Now what we want is if for some reason I need to delete this invoice, maybe it was in the wrong place or I didn't want it. If I delete this, I want it to remove the value from my time phase, but it's not going to, is it? Because I need a workflow that triggers on deletion. The workflows we have trigger on creating a new one or when I change the value. And I'll show you, if I delete invoice number 2, and you see it still says 1,000. If I refresh this, it's still going to show $1,000. So I'm going to jump back into my recycle bin. I'm going to restore that. All right. So now my invoice is back. So what we want to do to manage that is we're going to create another workflow very similar to the one we just created, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to trigger that based on when an object is deleted. Let's go to settings, configurations, and down to my custom object. So let's create our workflow to delete financials. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to start with the workflow I've already got, and I'm going to save as workflow. And I'm going to, so that way I don't have to retype everything. But what I'm going to do is say, I'm going to rename this one something like remove invoice time phase financials on deletion. There we go. Delete time phase data when an invoice is deleted. This is going to be triggered when a record is deleted. And so some of the actions we have in here can't be used when you do run it on deletion. I'll show you those in a moment. Let's see, we don't care so much about this first condition. That's not going to apply, but I do just want to make, there's no need to run this if I don't have a project or a date or a cost type, then I can't have time phase, so totally okay to keep those in there. We're going to set the same variable. We're still going to need to know that, so we're going to leave this. And for the set financial time phase data, yeah, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go into the same date range for this NLR, for this project. Remember I mentioned that this would be automatically populated by the system. That's okay. We don't need to worry about those. And the actual cost, what I'm going to do is I just need to subtract the cost because I'm deleting it and I want to pull that out of my financials. Now, here's an interesting thing. Little pro tip, you can't just put minus there. It doesn't like that. So what you have to do is have the cost times -1, and it likes that. Remember when we saved this, it said you can't run some of these actions when you delete an object? Well, one of those was our action that we used to have here, which was update project financials. So we're just going to delete that. And there we go. We should be good to go. Just to run through it, we have things being deleted. We run it on items that can have a time phase data, and we go set our variable, update the time phase data by subtracting the cost of the object being deleted. Save that, enable it. Now let's try it out. And I have actual cost of $1,000 in May for external labor. So let me delete the 751. And after I do that, we should see this go down to 250. Let's click refresh. Remember, it can take a minute to roll that up. Let's take a look. It's 250. That's right. We'll just give it a second. And there we go. We've updated to 250. So now we can add an invoice and have those costs be updated onto the actuals in my time phase. I can update the cost on that, and that will update what's in my time phase. And finally, when I delete an object, it will also remove that value from my time phase. We covered a lot of ground in today's video, so let's just do a quick recap. What we did today was we set up an invoice custom object. We created the custom object, created a relation to the project, added some custom fields, and then we updated the profile so that we could see that in related items and our add and edit screens. Then we did a little bit of work to set up some non-labor resources and created some reference fields for your NLRs, kind of an advanced concept for using organizational fields as variables in your workflows. Finally, we went through and created two important workflows. One would populate financial data in the project from your invoices. And finally, we had a nice cleanup workflow to help remove financials from deleted objects. And remember that although we took today's course and tried to keep it simple, as you saw, there was a lot that we covered, there are a lot more things you can do with this, from bill of materials and products to revenue forecasts, invoices sent, as well as invoices received, purchase orders, change requests, and of course, managing risks and contingencies. And there you go. I hope you got a lot out of today's session. If you think something like this could be really useful for your organization, but would like a little bit of help, well, you can contact us directly, and one of our Clarizen configuration experts can help you out. Just email us at ppmanswers@kolmegroup.com. You'll see contact information below. And as promised, we'll give you a link right now where you can download a checklist of all the steps we went through today. And if you like, you can get access to a configuration file, which has all the configurations we had today. If you do use the configuration file, though, make sure you look at the checklist. There will be some specific instructions you need to go through, even if you do install the config file. And here's that link. Thank you again for joining us today, and hope you get a lot of value out of this and have fun with invoices and time phase financials. Cheers.